Okay, so for those of you who are Dove listeners or watchers, Polina Leiser is a regular part of your morning coffee and drive time. Polina was born and raised in Siberia, but came to the United States on a Rotary exchange program. She actually attended Crater High School and went on to get a Bachelor's of Art and a Master's degree. She's taught at the college level, she's been a news reporter, and the Valley is privileged to have her here working at the Dove. Well, the issue of life transcends state and national boundaries, and since Polina came to us from a very foreign culture, I thought it'd be interesting to hear her speak on our issue from her unique perspective. So please welcome Polina Leiser.
Hello. Well, as Brian mentioned, I grew up in Siberia. And I grew up thinking that abortion was okay. I knew that if something happens to a woman, or if she makes a mistake, there is always a quick solution: abortion. What I didn't know was that every year in Soviet Union, 4.5 million babies were killed. It's 4.5 million. I also didn't realize that only 80 years prior to that, abortion was considered a criminal offense. So as I became older and started asking questions and wondering what happened to my country, how did the Holy Orthodox Russia, who for centuries was the stronghold of Christianity, who had more people killed for Christ than any other nation in the world, how did that country turn into a godless union of Soviet socialist republics? And the answer, I think, lies in people. See, the Imperial Russia had Orthodox leaders and was guided by Christian principles. There were values. There was right and there was wrong. Abortion was considered a murder. Both the woman and the doctor faced criminal charges and time in jail for killing babies. And while there were a lot of things that were right about that country, the spirit of times, or however you want to call it, people were bombarded by Western ideologies and confused by liberal thinking. As a result, pride, self-love, disobedience, and the idea that we can do it all without God almost destroyed my country. So in 1920, when communists came to power, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to legalize abortion. Of course, not everyone was pro-abortion, and there were a lot of people who remained followers of Christ. I think of my great-grandmother, and she wasn't going to be part of my speech, but for some reason, as I was sitting here, I remembered her because her husband was exiled to Siberia when she was pregnant with a second child. She had every right and every reason to give him up, and she didn't. She gave birth to her child, and when the doctor said it was okay for her to travel, she was exiled as well. She was sent on a train to Siberia and lost her baby that way. He died of pneumonia. But she didn't kill him. Well, going back to Soviet Union, in 1964, the country beat its own records. 5.6 million babies aborted. That's more than the population of Denmark, more than the population of Finland. I mean, it's the whole country. And you know, when you go that far and you fall so hard, it's really, really hard to get up. It's hard, but possible. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian people, hungry for God, flooded churches. They didn't come for entertainment. They didn't come for fellowship. They didn't even come for teaching. All they wanted was healing. they realized that the wounds of the soul can only be healed in one hospital, and that is church. And what's interesting is they didn't argue about theology. They didn't look for scriptures to justify their need for confession. They simply went to church, to the house of God, in order to touch heaven and pour their hearts to Christ. And luckily, our God is a loving God, and a God of second, third, and fourth chances. The last 20 years had been very difficult for my country. And I think it will probably take a decade or more to heal all the wounds and to make it right again. But already now we can see changes. The Russian government works closely with the Russian Orthodox Church to bring the number of the abortions down. Praising traditional values and holding up the Orthodox Church as the moral guide, President Putin recently signed a law which bans all advertisement of abortions. He's also working on his recently proposed legislation which will prohibit funding of abortions by health insurance. And even though the West keep calling him a tyrant and a dictator, his policies work. Since 1980s, the number of abortions in Russia decreased by 5 times. And I think one reason for that success is that Putin's policies chime with the conservative agenda of the church, who in its turn is unashamed to stand up for the life of the unborn. The reason why I decided to give you this short lesson on Russian history is because I wanted you to see that it wasn't the revolution that destroyed Russia, not even the government regulations. What happened was sin. Through sin, which is sickness, people lost communion with God. And by that, they deprived themselves of his life-giving power and his self-sacrificing love. And in that state, it was very, very hard for them, almost impossible to repent and fight evil. Have you ever wondered why Planned Parenthood is so successful? Why do they have so many women still using their services? And how do they manage to get millions of dollars in funding? I think the answer is really simple. They are not fighting the devil, but we are. We are in a real spiritual war here. And unless we know the enemy, unless we recognize who our real enemy is, and unless we use the right weapons to fight him, all our meetings, all our petitions, and all our rallies are in vain. Today's event is called Stand Up for Life. And I want to encourage you to, first of all, stand up for the life of your souls. Because there'll be speeches today, better ones. There'll be heartbreaking stories, there'll be horrifying statistics, and most of us will leave this place wanting to do something. And this is when the real battle will begin. Because the devil doesn't play by the rules. He'll do everything possible to destroy our churches, our families, and our relationships. One of my favorite saints, Elder Seraphim of Sarov, said, "Acquire a spirit of peace, and thousands around you will be saved." In other words, you can't save people around you unless you have the peace of God. And to tell you the truth, you'll never get that peace unless you clean your heart, unless you repent. One of the last things that Christ told his apostles before he left this world, this earth, was words about confession. Whatever sins you retain, they're retained. Whatever sins you forgive, they're forgiven. He also spoke earlier about confession, telling them to confess one to another so that you may be healed. Christ must have believed in the power of confession then why can't we? I know that my speech is probably different from what you're going to hear today, but I think it's also important for us to think about our souls. And as we renew our vows to this cause today, as we go on with more energy, ready to fight this battle, I ask you, I challenge you, start with your souls. Acquire the spirit of peace, and trust me, thousands, millions of babies will be saved. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Polina, so much. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, the Pregnancy Center